A forest in Ukraine. The scene of many thousands of murders. The murderers, who were from Germany, returned to hide their crimes. This time, all they left behind were the smoking and charred remains of the dead, discovered by Red Army soldiers as they advanced. The Nazis had tried to conceal their mass murders. Nothing was supposed to remain. Only a few clues point to the secret Sonderkommando, or Special Commando, responsible for the cover-up.
Operation 1005 was actually the first stage of Holocaust denial, because you could say there's nothing there.
Lviv is the largest city in western Ukraine. This lively metropolis in the historical region of Galicia has a turbulent history. Today, one of the city's darkest chapters is nearly invisible. Rüdiger Schalok is here, investigating a history connected with his own family. He's on the way to a former Jewish ghetto. Over 150,000 people were interned here after the Wehrmacht conquered the city in 1941. They were guarded by SS units, one of whom was Rüdiger Schalok's grandfather. A small memorial marks the atrocities committed by the Nazis against the Jewish population here.
This memorial is located directly at the entrance of the former ghetto. A total of 136,000 people perished during the German occupation.
When the Red Army liberated the city 3 years later, there were only a few hundred Jewish survivors in Lviv. The perpetrators had fled.
My grandfather came to Lviv in June 1941 with the 1st Einsatzkommando and was involved in various activities, including, unfortunately, Operation 1005, during which the bodies of those executed were exhumed and burned.
That means that SS officer Walter Schalok not only committed crimes, he was also involved in covering them up. A report by the Army High Command merely states that Special Commando 1005 had special tasks. What exactly did these special tasks entail? And what role did Schalok play in the ominous special unit? His grandson wants to know the truth. For years now, he's been researching his grandfather's deeds. They cast a dark shadow over the entire family. Almost 80 years after the end of the Second World War, the victims have not been forgotten. Olga Kulbachna and her team have set off on a research trip to an area some 100 kilometers from Lviv. They've been preparing for this trip for months. They work for an international organization which has set itself the task of finding forgotten sites of Nazi war crimes. The group came across the ominous Operation 1005. They hope to find further traces in the small town of Dobromil. The researchers have tracked down a man who spent his entire life here. Roshniak Grigorovich, who is almost 100 years old, still remembers the German occupation clearly.
There was a high fence. You couldn't see anything. Then I climbed onto a pile of wood and looked over. A very large hole had been dug there, and the people were herded into it. They had to strip down to their underwear first. At that moment, a German soldier came and said they would shoot us if we didn't leave.
He remembers being afraid. When the Germans returned, he stayed away.
They came back with trucks. They loaded corpses. The neighbors saw that.
This is the first time he's talking about it. How German soldiers reopened graves to cover up the mass murders. They forced prisoners of war to do the gruesome work here on this abandoned factory site. At the time, defeat was looming. The Germans were afraid their crimes would be discovered.
They were on the other side. There was a chicken coop. They took the Jews there on foot or by car. I don't remember. Then the German officer came and told the soldiers not to let anyone through. I ran. Otherwise, they would have killed me too.
The only witness still alive today. Aside from him, there is no one left who remembers the murder of some 500 Jewish people here in Dobromil. In many places, Special Commando 1005 succeeded in covering up almost every trace of their crimes. Here, only the pre-war Jewish cemetery remains, a few weathered stone slabs. The research in Ukraine is prepared and coordinated here in Paris by an organization that, to date, has researched more than 2,000 execution sites worldwide and collected more than 7,000 testimonies. Based in the Saint-Ouen district, the group is called Yahad in Unum, a combination of the Hebrew word Yahad, which means together, and the Latin expression in unum, meaning in one.
This is from the Soviet Commission. This is where we found the mass graves, and here you can see the train station.
Here, research trips to the sites of mass murders are planned. The sites are part of what is known as the Holocaust by Bullets, a term coined by Catholic priest Patrick Desbois, the organization's founder. He remains part of the group's leadership along with German lawyer and historian André Umansky.
In the beginning, the idea was to research some mass graves of Jews who had been shot. We thought there wouldn't be many. We would maybe make 2 or 3 trips. But after a year, we were still in the same district because there were mass graves in all of the villages. So we needed a very specialized forensic methodology.
It's like working on a cold case. You have certain sources, you have archive material, you have books, you have historians who write articles. And with this as a basis, you can then look for people on the ground who saw what happened and confront them with it. And then with the help of these eyewitnesses, you can find the exact location of the shooting. We also try to recreate the topography of the murder. In other words, we record all these points using a GPS. We only leave a location after we understand how the whole thing happened, from dawn to dusk.
The Bolsheviks are trapped. Their desperate resistance is soon broken by our troops.
Until the 1990s, the Wehrmacht maintained the image of a regular army, one that fought on Hitler's orders, but otherwise acted according to international rules of warfare. In fact, many of these combat units did not adhere to these rules. Civilians suffered the most.
We are still investigating the details, because the Germans killed so many people. Through shooting alone, they killed over 2 million people. Jews, gypsies, Soviet prisoners. According to official figures, the total is around 20 million. So we have just as much to do as the task forces did back then.
Today, these units stand for terror and murder. On Hitler's orders, Heinrich Himmler set up 4 of these death squads. Task Force A, B, C, and D. Made up of some 3,000 men in total, they followed the regular units on their advance to the east. Their task? To fight and destroy enemy elements in the conquered territories. On the ground, they carried out what would later be institutionalized on an industrial scale in the concentration camps: the extermination of all Jews. The traces of these murders were later covered up by the Special Commando 1005. In Lviv, Rüdiger Scharlock is on his way to the former residence of his grandfather, SS First Officer Walter Scharlock. This building was the headquarters of the commander of the security police and the security service. Later, the Special Commando 1005 operated from here.
In the end, this was also the headquarters for communication with the Judenrat. So all the organization of executions, ghetto evictions, and so on were planned and carried out here.
Scharlock's responsibility included the Janowska labor camp, where up to 15,000 prisoners were interned and subjected to arbitrary cruelty. To entertain their tormentors, a camp orchestra even had to play, for hours, until their fingers bled.
As an officer, I think he was somewhere in the middle command level or a little below. Not one of the big leaders. But he was responsible for many, many crimes. And he functioned well in this system.
Scharlock was responsible for transporting prisoners from the Janowska labor camp to either the Nazi extermination camps or the surrounding sandy hills. The camp orchestra was forced to play the Tango of Death, a holocaust by bullets, the full cruelty of which is only becoming known today. Mass murder set to classical music. And it wasn't just the SS death squads. Policemen and ordinary soldiers carried out atrocities too, as described by a German corporal at a Russian court-martial.
Our group of 12 men was informed of our work by the group leader.
What did he tell you?
We were to gather the Jews and shoot them.
The organizers of the mass murder had planned their crimes down to the last detail.
How many people did you yourself shoot in Lviv during this time?
In Lviv, 120 men.
Few memorials mark the mass murders. For decades, relatives had no place to remember or to mourn. Yahad in Unum wants to change that. Researchers have found hundreds of execution sites where Special Commando 1005 was unable to cover every trace. Another eyewitness lives here, in a small hamlet close to the Polish border. "87-year-old Stanislava Koloshina remembers it well. She was a little girl on her way to the train station with her mother.
A German soldier stopped us. Back, back, he shouted, and wouldn't let us through. From a distance, we saw a lot of people dressed only in shirts, the men in their underpants. They had to go to this trench, and there was the whole military, the German soldiers. They were shooting, shooting, shooting. It was terrible. We were scared when we saw that. My mother cried. Me too. Maybe a month later. I don't remember exactly. I was there again. There was a vehicle, and they fenced off the whole area and covered it with a big curtain. And then they dug up the bodies. People said they took the gold teeth.
The eyewitnesses have carried these memories for decades. Only now are they sharing them with the young people from faraway France. Operation 1005 surfaces repeatedly in connection with the atrocities committed by the Nazis. A historian in Berlin has been researching the secret operation for many years. André Angrek sits on the advisory board of Jihad in Unum. A world-renowned expert, he's written 2 books on the subject.
Operation 1005 was the order issued by the highest Reich leadership at the beginning of 1942. We can't trace it back exactly, but ultimately it goes back to Hitler himself, to remove and eliminate all mass graves, all traces of mass crimes. In this case, they were to find the mass graves again, have them opened, destroy the bodies in them, and destroy the graves, no matter in what form or with what technology. However, this undertaking was so secret that they did not want to come up with an associative code name for it. They simply named it after a file number within the Gestapo, the next procedure. In other words, 1005 was the 1005th case of the year 1942. That's how Operation 1005 was named.
Task Force A alone had reported murdering almost 220,000 Jews. The traces of their massacres had to be removed by Special Commando 1005, but the Germans did not want to get their hands dirty. They forced their victims to. For the Nazis, they were not considered human, but tools.
Das musste von Menschen außen durchgeführt werden, die aus den Lagern.
This had to be carried out by people from outside. They were taken out of the camps. They were mostly Jews, but they could also have been prisoners of war. They were considered objects, things. That is, they were treated as dehumanized, objectified figures who were to be murdered after 2 weeks, according to protocol, because they were secret bearers. For practical reasons, the supervising perpetrators, the Gestapo, members of the security service, or ordinary policemen, then insisted on keeping their objects alive longer, because they worked relatively well. So these people were only murdered when their jobs ended. They were then the last to be forced to climb up onto these piles where the bodies were burned. And they were shot there. And they were burned together with the bodies that they had previously retrieved.
Words could not describe it, reported the few survivors. One SS officer had planned the gruesome logistics down to the last detail and was largely responsible for them. Paul Blobel from Solingen, a city known for blade making in a mountain region of Germany. He had initially studied architecture in the neighboring town of Wuppertal. Historian Michael Okroy has spent a long time researching and writing about the war criminal.
Paul Blobel was an architect, and he worked in this profession for quite a while here in this region. Some of his houses still exist.
Like many war criminals, Paul Blobel left his bourgeois existence behind with the rise of the Nazis. He committed himself entirely to the Nazis' ideology and went from building houses to becoming the architect of the machinery of death.
Seit 1931 Mitglied der SA.
He had been a member of the SA since 1931 and rose through the ranks relatively quickly. He made a career in the SS apparatus. The Special Commando 4A, which he led, is responsible for around 60,000 murdered Jews, part of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, where people were killed on the spot.
Later, as part of Operation 1005, Blobel removed evidence that led directly to his own crimes. In Babin Yar, a German military photographer casually recorded the horror surrounding the mass murders in the ravine near Kyiv. Only a few survivors were able to report what happened. Here, a Ukrainian witness named Ludmila Pronicheva testified before a court-martial.
Then they started shooting. I closed my eyes, clenched my fists, tensed all my muscles, and jumped. The fall seemed to take an eternity. I landed on the bodies and was still alive. I was very careful. Eventually, I managed to crawl to a wall of the ravine. It was very difficult to get to the top.
Today, trees grow in the Babin Yar ravine. But within the span of 48 hours, some 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered here. For a long time, nothing marked the massacre in the park, where Kyiv's residents spend their leisure time. Only in the early 1990s was a memorial erected. To mark the 80th anniversary of the mass murders in Babin Yar, a large memorial was held at the site. A light installation projected images of those murdered onto the site. Guests from all over the world traveled to Kyiv, including the heads of state of both Israel and Germany, Herzog and Steinmeier. Patrick Desbois and Andrei Umansky were also there. Shostakovich's 13th Symphony, named after Babin Yar, was played. Afterwards, German President Steinmeier recalled the Nazi attempts to cover up the massacre.
Die Täter versuchten, alle Spuren beseitigen zu lassen, ihre Verbrechen zu vertuschen.
The perpetrators tried to have all traces removed in order to cover up their crimes, but they couldn't be removed. The evidence remains. The shadows of the crimes, the scars of war are still visible today. This is another reason why we must remember. Without honest remembrance, there is no good future.
Honest remembrance. A painful process for the descendant of one of the perpetrators. After traveling into the past, returning to everyday life is difficult. Rüdiger Schallock lives in Hamburg. He grew up in nearby Schleswig-Holstein. His grandfather was from Stettin, a city in what is now Poland. He only came to northern Germany after the war. His wartime past was taboo for a long time. It took decades to uncover the family secret. He is still putting pieces of the puzzle together.
I actually have very few pictures of my grandfather. We see him here on the left as a young, good-looking man. At that time, he had been a member of the NSDAP for 3 years, and he was a member of the SS. Here is his fiancée. This is one of the few photos from the 60s in which I can be seen together with my father. I saw relatively little of him in my childhood. My father and mother separated fairly early on. My father moved out in 1965. And the origin of that was actually due to what my grandfather had done. This is something I confirmed through my research. There were events during the time my grandfather was in Lviv that my father must have witnessed as a small child, which threw his life off course too. And these things naturally left certain impressions on me. These things still have an effect. It's like this memorial in Lviv to those killed in the ghetto. The wound never heals.
The research is also a kind of therapy. Now, it has occupied his spare time for years. A picture has gradually emerged. Harrowing documents, including those that relate to Operation 1005, lead deeper and deeper into the family's secrets. Connections are still emerging. The trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key figures in what's known as the final solution of the Jewish question. He was tried in Jerusalem in 1961. One of the witnesses was a man named Leon Welitska. As a 16-year-old, he was a prisoner in Lviv's Janowska camp.
How could you stand it? How could you survive? What gave you the will to go on?
It was a will of responsibility that somebody has to tell and to tell the world to be the remaining part and tell the will of returning exactly that the idea of the whole Nazism was to kill all the Jews.
Welitska had to work for the Special Commando 1005 under Walter Scharlock. Years later, after adopting the name Wells, he wrote a book and spoke publicly about it.
It was Sonderkommando 1005. Our job will be to undug all the graves, to clean out all these bodies and burn them on a fire and take out the gold from gold teeth. We had different groups in the dead brigade. One group was the digging group. The other group was carrying the corpses to the wood. We laid out wood and burned one order of wood, and afterwards bodies. Afterwards next wood. Afterwards bodies. And afterwards, when it was high enough, about 2,000 bodies, you put on kerosene over it, and you set it on fire. After the fire was finished, there was another group that was called ash colonne, colonne of ashes, that took the ashes and the gold or any valuables were taken out.
The architects of death thought of everything, even the unthinkable. This was a bone mill. Even the last remnants of the corpses burned at the stake were to disappear, and their valuables sifted out. Desbois found the gruesome machine in an extermination camp and brought it to Paris.
Ça a procuré un tas de problèmes parce que qu'est-ce qu'on fait de ça?
What do you do with the remains of the bones?
Ces machines, je les ai trouvées à Belzec.
I found these machines in Belzec with the village chief,
qui avait été mis en place par les
who was employed by the Germans.
On leur avait demandé de prêter.
The locals had to hand over the mills they used to separate barley from wheat.
Et les Allemands ont changé.
The Germans then replaced the grids and set them up in the extermination camp. When the Jews were dead and burned, their ashes were put in there to find all the gold teeth they still had.
Desbois has been publishing his findings on the Holocaust by bullets for years. He is the face of Jihad in Unum. In the meantime, many young researchers too have taken on leading roles. In addition to basic research, the trips to the crime scenes are coordinated here in Paris. Jihad in Unum is now involved in the search for mass graves and the reconstruction of forgotten crimes worldwide.
Also zunächst einmal ist es so, dass wir mittlerweile ein Verein sind, der...
Well, first of all, we are now an association with around 25 people here in Paris. The nice thing is that there are many young people from different nations. The French are in the minority. We have colleagues from Eastern Europe, Guatemala, and the USA. And that has always been the strength of the association. Because we quickly realized that it can't always just be about one nation. You need connections to the countries in which we work. That's how to achieve success.
Employees from all over the world meet in Paris. Andrei Umansky often travels here from his home in Cologne, where he works as a lawyer, campaigning for human rights activists all over the world. For him, the work is closely related. The past leads directly to the present.
Wie Pater Dubois sagte einmal, man kann kein Europa auf Massengräber.
As Father Dubois once said, you can't build a Europe on mass graves. You have to imagine that people are still buried like animals in these countries. They were never properly buried. Their families, their relatives, their descendants don't even know where they are. And many of these places are not even marked. This means that aside from some of these eyewitnesses, no one else even knows exactly where these places are. The special thing is that what we have heard repeatedly is not, "What do you want?" or "Why are you interested?" Instead, a much more surprising question. People always said, "Why are you only coming now? I've waited so long for you. I'm so old now. I've forgotten so much. Why weren't you here 10, 20, 30 years ago?"
Those who lived in the immediate vicinity of a shooting site often witnessed the crimes by chance, despite the fact that the occupying forces ordered them not to leave their homes. The eyewitnesses still alive today were children at the time. So far, Jihad in Unum's researchers have identified thousands of crime scenes. Local teams visit the sites twice a year.
Maybe there's someone at the school or in the community, but most of them are already dead.
This was once Dornfeld, where German colonists lived in the former Kingdom of Galicia, which belonged to Austria. Under the Nazis, Jews here were hunted down. This almost 90-year-old woman remembers.
I was still a child. I can remember a long line of people, men, women, and children, marching through the village. I thought it was a festival or some kind of parade. Later I asked my aunt and she said, yes, that's how they drove the Jews out.
Nothing remains of the town's former Jewish inhabitants, but there is a ruined cemetery on the edge of the village. Until the war, Germans and Ukrainians, Jews or not, lived on good terms, the weathered inscription reads. No final resting place was found for their fellow citizens, neighbors, and friends who were victims of National Socialist racial ideology. Victims of people like Walter Schallock. His grandson visits a horrific sight. A simple poster at the bus stop marks the Janowska labor camp on the outskirts of Lviv. Today, it is a dense forest. Back then, thousands of prisoners were shot and buried in the sandy hills. Later, the mass graves were desecrated again as part of Operation 1005. All human remains were removed. A simple memorial stone commemorates at least 50,000 victims. Other estimates put the number of dead as high as 200,000.
Many mass executions took place here. If we look down here, in front of me, you can also see something of the geography where it took place. It's a valley. My grandfather was also active here in the end. The exhumation and cremation of the dead was carried out here on a large scale. The journey is really very emotional for me at times. On the one hand, I get a lot of new information that spurs me on to do more research and look deeper into certain things. But there are also moments when I am simply very moved, and I have to deal with that.
A weathered plaque is all that marks the actual camp. Rüdiger Schallock would have liked a more dignified memorial.
Where we've just walked, it looks like a garbage dump in places. People come here to dump their household waste. The municipality, the state, whoever is responsible for it, does nothing to preserve and commemorate this place.
But this may be changing. As if hearing his wish, a delegation from the American State Department appears that same day. They are equally surprised by the chance encounter.
We're here looking at the Jewish sites in Lviv, just to commemorate the victims and to
make sure that the grounds and the holy places will be preserved.
Sorry? My grandfather has been one of the perpetrators who was based here in Lemberg from the first day the Germans occupied the city, and he's been involved in a lot of crimes over here. So more than 10 years ago I started research on that, and since then I'm coming back the second time here to continue with this work a little bit.
Wow, that must be very difficult for you, but that's really admirable that you are looking into what happened.
I'm still working on that, make it understandable for other people as well, and to keep it for the future, for my kids, their kids, and other ones.
Right. No, that's so important.
Rüdiger Schallock wants to return to Ukraine. In fact, he's already planned his next visit. In Germany, he's discovered what happened to his grandfather after the war. Walter Schallock made it through the country's denazification process without issue. Not only that.
In den 50ern hat dann auch einen Antrag auf Wiedergutmachung gestellt.
In the 1950s, he applied for compensation as someone who had been involved in the war. That's to say, there were certain procedures and opportunities for obtaining financial compensation for what you had suffered during the war. It made me think, how can you be so hard-boiled and cynical that you basically wipe away everything that happened? And I think now I'm doing what I can, as much as I can.
In 1961, Schallock was brought to trial after all. He managed to evade the proceedings due to an allegedly serious illness. He lived freely in Schleswig-Holstein until his death in 1974. The crimes had already caught up with his superior, Paul Blobel. The pyres, the murders, and the attempts to cover them up. The architect of death was arrested on the run and put on trial in Nuremberg. The sentence was death by hanging. On June 7, 1951, he was hanged along with 6 other war criminals. The last death sentences to be carried out on German soil.